You may have heard that the National Park Service is hiding Bigfoot, but are you aware that the US Forest Service may be hiding the Dogman? I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. On the far western side of Kentucky, just on the border between that state and Tennessee, there is a national forest called Land Between the Lakes. It is a massive, beautiful wilderness area, but if certain legends are to be believed, there is a very dark secret hiding there. As the stories go, a creature of some kind has been known to stalk this region for, depending on who you ask, at least the last 50 or so years, but potentially as far back as the 1700s. How exactly this monster is described varies from source to source, with some saying that it is a giant creature over 11.5 feet tall, while others paint a more realistic 6'5". Sometimes the thing is said to be very humanoid, almost more like a Sasquatch than anything else, but in other versions of the story it has canine features, much like the Dogman described in the Midwest. But there are a few details of these stories that seem to remain consistent, and in some cases, it seems like these are all multiple versions of one event. These include details like families of 4 being targeted, one member of the family being carried off a ways, and of course that whatever this thing is, it is covered in dark fur or hair. And of course, because there are no official records of any of these incidents or this one key incident ever actually occurring, there has been added this layer that it's a government cover-up. Something actually happened, and the reason that there's no news media about it at all is that the feds got there first. Or at least the feds got there before the media did. Now, this was the 1980s, you didn't have internet yet, and this is an extremely rural part of the United States. So, theoretically, if some government agency were able to get their claws onto this before it made it public, you could keep it a complete secret for 50 years. Of course, why then does this story suddenly start to crop up on the internet over the last 2 decades? Well, from what I can tell, the earliest reference, at least the earliest written reference, to a legend of some kind of monster living in the lands between the lakes comes from a 2004 post to the website Guardian Tales by a Jan Thompson. The story, however, took place in 1982. At the outset of her narrative, Jan explains that she wasn't a witness to the fact, just a third person making observations and having conversations with 2 individuals who were part of the incident, who were involved in the whole ordeal. Now, specifically, she says she was working the night shift at a gas station a few miles down from the Kentucky Dam when 2 officers of the law stopped by around 3 a.m. Jan described their appearance as shaken beyond description, a mixture of fear and confusion, shock and disbelief emanating from them both. After these men sat outside for a few minutes, one of them paler than the other and throwing up between his own legs, the other officer entered the store to buy a couple of coffees and grab a cup of water for his sick friend. Jan didn't give the real names of these officers, who she would later say she was on a first-name basis with, but assigned them the pseudonyms Adam and Bill, Adam being the sick one. Now, as I said, these men were not strangers to Jan, and this was, in her opinion, a possible reason that they disclosed so much when protocol should have kept them both tight-lipped. You see, since there were no other customers at this late hour, Jan spent some time chatting with the men outside, which is how she learned that they'd spent the last 8 hours at some kind of crime scene inside of the Land Between the Lakes. At first, the officers only gave vague statements of disbelief about what they had seen. After some time, however, they began to provide her with fragmented details, both of them still appearing deeply unsettled. And you know what else is deeply unsettling? Having your personal data appear online. And that's why I'd like to introduce you to our sponsor for today's video, Delete Me, a subscription service that works tirelessly to remove your personal data from the web. Now, you might be wondering, why do I need my personal data removed from the web? Well, aside from scam calls and other annoyances that come out of it, identity theft and other problems are a genuine concern. In fact, research done by Delete Me shows that the volume of personal data on individuals available online has tripled between 2019 and 2023 to an average of 525 pieces of information per person available for free or as little as just $5. I can tell you, having worked in the marketing industry myself, that we were able to get a lot of information about any given person just from them filling out a little email field. A common saying with online services is that if the service is free, it's because you are the product, and that is a very true statement. Most of the time, it's just going to be used for marketing purposes, but now and then, the wrong kind of people are going to get a hold of your information, and whether they are stalkers, identity thieves, or any other kind of online miscreant, you don't want them to have it. So when you sign up for Delete Me, they ask you to give them the information you want removed from the internet. They then run an algorithm which scans internet listing sites for your data and file takedown requests on your behalf without another word. Now, in the past, some people have commented when we've done ads for Delete Me saying, so I'm just giving my information to yet another service. Well, it's about control. You're giving Delete Me that information so that it won't appear anywhere. Delete Me is not going to share it. So if you would like to give Delete Me a try and get your personal data removed from the internet, you can get 20% off of all Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use the promo code LORELODGE at checkout. Once again, that is joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use code LORELODGE at checkout. That night at the gas station, Bill did most of the talking, explaining first how they'd been called in to help with an investigation at one of the many rural campgrounds down in LBL. A young married couple had come across a ghastly scene while on a weekend getaway, and then immediately driven out to nearby Grand Rivers to report what they'd seen. When Bill and Adam arrived, it was just before sunset, and while the story never gives an exact date for this incident, there are a few details that can help us triangulate that aspect. Thompson noted that the tourist season was about to start in a few weeks, and according to a U.S. Forest Service report published in December of 2004, peak visitation runs between April and November. That means that these events probably occurred sometime between mid to late March or early April of 1972. Since they had supposedly been on scene for about 8 hours, then they should have arrived around 7 p.m. And since we know that they arrived before sunset, it must have been after daylight saving switched over on the 10th. Beyond that, it's hard to establish further details. When they pulled up to the scene, Bill told Jan, several other official vehicles were already there and there were many more to come. There were deputies from multiple counties and even one from another state, most likely Tennessee. There was already crime scene tape placed in numerous scattered parts of the area, Jan wrote, and little white flags on metal stakes stuck into the ground marking evidence. One county coroner was already there, as was a single ambulance, but over the next few hours, several more coroners from neighboring counties are said to have been called in. That's not exactly typical, but it can happen, and it could be the result of a number of things. For one, Grand Rivers is part of Livingston County, which only borders the park. For that reason, it's possible the Livingston County coroner, Harry Van Smith, called the coroners of Leon or Lyon, Trigg, and Stewart counties due to their jurisdictions over sections of the forest. It may also be relevant that Harry Van Smith was elected coroner in 1975 when he was just 5 years out of high school. It is therefore very unlikely that he possessed any sort of medical expertise, and for that reason, it seems like another possibility is that he wanted a second opinion based on what was left of the victims once he saw what it was he was dealing with. Outside of a motorhome, its exterior marked by bloody, trailing handprints, investigators found the remains of 3 individuals, 2 adults and a child, who appeared to have been chopped to pieces. It was determined that this was a family, the older woman and man being the parents and the child being their son. In addition, the doors on the camper were open, with one hanging by one hinge in a crooked slant. To make matters worse, the remains found outside of the trailer were only one piece of the puzzle. Thompson described how, according to Bill, clothes befitting a young girl were packed inside of the camper, meaning that one family member was still unaccounted for. As to what killed these people, the first thought was that it must have been a man or a group of men with axes or chainsaws, but the coroner wasn't so sure about that. To him, it appeared that these bodies weren't cut by tools, but rather ripped apart by claws or teeth. The claw marks on the back of the father's corpse, Jan wrote, were distinctively made by 4 long claws with a smaller digit like a thumb on the side. Its span was wider than a man's print, wider and different than a bear's mark, with deep, deliberate gouges in the flesh. The detailed description continued, Thompson relaying from Bill that they seemed to be rake marks from an angry, unknown source trying to grab its prey that was no doubt trying to escape. That seemed to rule out humans, but the wounds that they were seeing were too large to have been caused by the claws or teeth of a wolf, coyote, or wildcat. The American red wolves native to the area are smaller on average than the gray wolves common further north, and coyotes smaller still. Bobcats, the only wildcats confirmed by authorities to live in the area, also have claws and mouths that are too small. In addition to the inhuman appearance of the wounds, Bill also reportedly said that there were indications in the larger areas of the cadavers of bite marks where the flesh, meat, and bone had been yanked away from the body. This apparently led some to question if this had been a bear attack, but Jan wasn't so sure she believed that. Bears, she wrote, aren't native to the area, but who knows? Maybe a grizzly did sneak in some way, but that was far-fetched. He would have had to have traveled several states and crossed several rivers to even get close to that part of Kentucky. Now, she's mostly right, as according to the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife Department, historical accounts indicate that bears were essentially eliminated from the area by the early 1900s. It's unclear exactly when they began returning, but the Fish and Wildlife Department website mentions a growing population over the last 20 years via natural migration rather than restocking. Now, to be clear, that is talking about black bears, not grizzly bears. But it's possible that this migration, this natural growth in the bear population began earlier than just the last 20 years. But even if it did, the problem is that black bears typically don't attack groups of people unless they're desperate or they feel threatened. Still, those present seem to be of the opinion that it had to be a bear attack because nothing else seemed possible. So, as the investigation began, there were now two goals: determine what it was that had attacked this family, and find the missing child. The latter issue was soon resolved, and unfortunately not in the way that anybody would have hoped. One of the investigators had made his way about 50 yards into the woods from the campfire, which now served as the nexus of their efforts, only for those nearby to hear him shrieking, wailing, and faintly whimpering. When everybody rushed over to him, they saw that, high in the tree, their flashlights were illuminating the body of a lifeless little girl. The officer who found her only did so because he felt blood drip down onto his hat as he walked, and this was the very same man who now sat next to Bill as he told the story, Adam. It clicked for Jan why the latter deputy looked so much more pale than his companion, as Bill described the half-eaten corpse they saw carefully laid out across a tree branch, long gray and brown hair found sticking to the bark of the tree. Matching hairs had been found earlier as the scene was processed, and Jan wrote that one of the doctors noticed something wrapped between the dead fingers of one of the father's hands. It was a clump of long gray and brown hairs, which was placed in an evidence bag and taken away by police for testing. After about 7 hours, Thompson continued, most of the officers were sent away as a new team of investigators arrived. Those initially on scene were told not to speak to anyone about the incident, and especially not the media. But Bill and Adam talked to Jan Thompson, and they even returned to her gas station about a month later. They were both rather quiet, she explained, more serious in nature. They had both aged in some odd way. Their hair had grayed and wrinkles now lined their faces. Perhaps feeling it was only fair that they update her, Bill and Adam told Jan that the test results had come back regarding the hair and the saliva recovered from the bodies. The species was unknown, but the closest comparable species was reportedly Canis lupus. Whatever this thing was that attacked this family, it wasn't a person, but rather some relative of the wolf. But the story of this spring 1982 massacre was not the only one that Jan Thompson submitted to Guardian Tales. A second entry came several days after the first one, in which the author described a personal encounter which she says occurred in July of 1978. She was staying with her aunt in Grand Rivers, which sits just across the Barkley Canal from Land Between the Lakes. The house itself was a very welcome home at the end of a dead-end road, amongst hundreds of acres of woods which surrounded the home. The structure was described as being built into the side of a large hill of dirt, and Jan wrote that several homemade trails wove throughout the woods leading to several places. One led to a defunct rail track, another to an abandoned sawmill, and several others out towards the shoreline of the Kentucky Lake on the western side of the canal. Now, given that in Grand Rivers there is a house which sits at the end of a dead-end road called Thompson Avenue, surrounded by acres of forest on a hillside with what certainly looks to be an old abandoned rail track not far away, I think I have located the home in question. That said, I can't be certain that I'm correct, especially because this entire area has changed so much in the last 50 years. In any case, Thompson herself was 17 when this story occurred, though it was her 13-year-old cousin Joe who had the initial encounter. Jan was playing with her younger cousin, 10-year-old Rhonda, when she heard Joe's dirt bike screaming at an almost soprano type of gear, long, steady, and fast with no shifting sounds. She furthermore described it as just a straight scream of one gear in motion with a full throttle going at top speed, indicating he was making a beeline back to the house rather than just messing around in the woods. As he came over the hill and then rather ungracefully dismounted his bike, panic wild in his eyes, he shouted, "It grabbed me, then look at my leg." Glancing down, Jan saw that her cousin's Levi jeans had been torn open along the thigh by what seemed to be some kind of animal's claws. Before anyone could ask questions, however, Joe started shouting again, yelling that whatever attacked him walked on two legs and had followed him along his dirt bike path all the way from the abandoned sawmill. He was able to pretty clearly describe what it was that was chasing him, noting that it was hairy and had a long snout, and clarifying that as it chased him, it ran on two legs. Joe all but forced the two girls to go back into his parents' house, only for the creature to appear atop the hill as they neared the door. At first, Thompson wrote, it appeared to be a very large wolf emerging from the dark outline of the trees, but as it approached that one-lane road that connected to the driveway, its height grew to a towering shadow that stood on two legs. Once fully upright, the beast stood a full foot taller than the average man, covered in black hair and sporting a long, canine-like snout. The children ran inside and barricaded the doors, waiting for Jan's aunt to return home, her Cadillac pulling up just after they heard the sound of a window breaking downstairs. But Jan's aunt had a system, which was that when she came home with groceries, she would honk the horn a couple of times, which was the kids' signal to run outside and help carry everything in. So, when she honked, it seemed that maybe she scared this thing off. I say that because she had no problem getting inside the house. Nothing attacked her. And when she entered, Jan and her cousins were, at this point, hiding inside the master bedroom with knives drawn in case of the worst. When her aunt entered the home and saw them so armed, she was at first angry, wondering why on earth they were playing with knives. After a little bit of back and forth, Joe eventually did manage to get his story out, and according to Jan, her aunt didn't laugh, she didn't respond at all at first. In fact, she never said a word until she came back from inspecting the windows in the bedrooms. Now, after looking around the house, Jan says that her aunt said indeed there was a broken window, broken from the outside in, but she said nothing more of it to the children, preferring to wait until she could discuss it with her husband when he returned home that night. Now, Joe and Rhonda's father had a pretty simple solution to the problem at hand, which was to tell his children and his niece to stay out of the woods. Apparently, he reached this conclusion after he himself traveled out to the abandoned sawmill early the next morning. Once there, he discovered several pits dug and filled with animal bones, as well as parts of carcasses along the path that led to the old sawmill that couldn't be explained. She added that there were also holes dug into the sides of the bluff along the hills that overlooked the old mill that looked like deep caves big enough for a man to hide in. Now, not only that, but apparently there used to be a Boy Scout camp on the other side of town, and the boys there had at some point seen an unexplained creature with wolf features walking along the edge of the waters close to the campsites. In fact, he even said that he and his older son had seen it once themselves. Since she had these experiences as a young woman, Jan says that she's talked to a number of people from the area who have encountered or at least heard of the beast. Many of those conversations happened on a bench outside of the very same IGA grocery store her aunt worked at in 1978. It also wasn't long after the events of July 1978, just 4 years later, that the first story she submitted is said to have occurred. Then, in the early 1990s, Jan wrote, her father accompanied Joe back to that same old abandoned sawmill. describing her cousin and her father as two brave men, the bravest I know of, both of whom served in the military and fought in two separate wars of their own time. Jan claims that they returned ashen-faced and bewildered. The two veterans expressed that they both experienced the feeling of being watched and felt an uneasiness that something just wasn't right. An eerie quiet had hung about the place, where no life stirred as they explored the area. Even the birds seemed reluctant to fly directly overhead, almost as if they could sense that something evil lurked below. The bone pits were still there, fresh ones now accompanying those Joe's father reported seeing in 1978. And neither man could shake the sense that a large black shadow was peering out at them from deep within one of those holes carved into the bluff. Now, according to Jan, her father's response to the entire issue was, much like her uncle's, to just avoid the woods. He told her that there are some things you just can't explain, that science doesn't know about it, and these things should be left alone. All of this had quite an impact on Jan, who became very interested in the paranormal world in the years that followed. Like many invested in fields such as demonology, or in this case cryptozoology, Jan saw these things as not necessarily beyond the realm of reality, but rather beyond our current scientific understanding of the world. What she saw out there wasn't contrary to science, it was simply yet to be explained. In 2005, Jan sat for an interview with Guardian Tales publisher San Perry, in which she explained her opinions of the overall subject of supernatural entities and experiences. Asked what she believed the beast of the land between the lakes to be, Jan said that initially she thought it to have been a werewolf, but she struggled with this explanation because it went in the direction of actually believing in vampires, zombies, and Frankenstein monsters. At the same time, she questioned if believing in such things was really so absurd. Wasn't every legend, she asked herself, based on some form of actual incident, fact, or figure in history? Still, out of fear for her reputation, she chose to refer to it simply as a beast when telling others about the events. Decades later, while speaking with Bigfoot enthusiasts in 2005, she learned that some sightings of America's most famous legendary creature lined up with what she believed she observed all those years ago. Furthermore, these descriptions were found almost exclusively east of the Mississippi. So for Jan, this was a much more reasonable explanation than a shape-shifting creature like a werewolf, and it was comforting to hear that others had experienced the same thing. But why did it take so long, over 20 years, for Jan to find other people like her? Why was it that everyone else was so quiet about the land between the lakes? In Jan's opinion, the reason nobody else had come forward about the events of 1982 was simply fear of ridicule, of being considered crazy or a liar. In addition, she argued that the powers that be came and took over the crime scene, had all witnesses involved threatened with some form of punishment if they ever did open their mouths up about what really happened or what they truly saw. In a further post to Guardian Tales, labeled LBL Investigation and also published in 2005, Jan explained that she met up with a group of Bigfoot researchers a year prior and had taken them out to the locations noted in both the 1978 and 1982 stories. By this time, the area had changed quite a bit. The sawmill had been demolished, Jan writing that on one side of the woods there was a new subdivision going in, and that a few miles away on the other side of the forest, some barge companies had made a coal and rock depot. Now, the house at the end of Thompson Avenue is between two locations matching these descriptions, so I believe it's very likely that the sawmill was somewhere nearby and that I do have the correct home. The location for the incident that occurred actually within the Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area did have more directions, but it was no easier to find than that house. According to Jan, it was one road down on the left past a popular campsite, quickly followed by another turn at a cemetery, then driving through a creek bed, and finally off to the right into a small clearing. At least that's how it was back in 1982 when she first visited it herself. By 2004, however, that first road to the left past a popular campsite turned out to be a new road put in that just ran into the main road to the major campsite, meaning their route would be different. I will say, it was extremely frustrating to me that Jan could have given the exact locations here and simply chose not to. All of these are public land. There was no reason she couldn't just give the name of the road and the name of the campsite. Anyway, when they did eventually get where they were trying to go, they found a set of 2 concrete block bunkers, one of them built into the ground and only accessible via a hatch at the top. There were also 4 others a little ways into the woods, but by this point they had been reduced to rubble and rebar. The Bigfoot researchers there with Jan that day suggested that this all could be because of the fact that when something out of the extreme ordinary happens, as may have been the case with this alleged family killing by an unknown predator, the feds usually come in and take over. There are some other possible explanations, but I'll be getting to that. I tried very hard to figure out where this location actually was, but nothing on the map seems to fit with what's described here. That said, the folks over at the channel Cryptid Kentucky believe they've found it, and from what I can tell, their location seems to check enough boxes. In particular, they were able to find a set of concrete bunkers. Their footage makes me feel confident that these bunkers were not constructed as a result of whatever happened in 1982, partially because some of them are just fully open, don't even have doors, they're just basically a concrete room with an opening. But on the other hand, I'm not precisely sure what they would have been used for either. Feel free to check out the video yourself over on their channel, and if I ever get the chance to travel out there myself, I will be sure to ask the Forest Service if they can tell me what these bunkers are for. But for Jan, all of this was looking more and more like an episode from the X-Files. She asked why the road was shut down, why the creek was redirected, and why these concrete bunkers had been constructed. Did the feds indeed come in, she pondered, take over, and hunt something down? The answer to that question lies within yet another, much more important one. Did any of this actually happen? Over the last 2 decades, several more people have come forward telling their own stories about their experiences within the land between the lakes, though few of these are so violent or terrifying as the one described by Jan Thompson. People describe feeling watched, finding footprints, or even catching a glimpse of a tall, hairy, wolf-like creature standing or running on 2 legs. All much the same as with Bigfoot. One individual by the name of Roger, however, has since come forward with his own account of what happened that very night in 1982, and he says that it happened on April 7th of that year. As for how I found this story, it comes from a video made by Hunter over at Wolfk Outdoors, who it seems may have spoken with Roger himself, but definitely compiled his story from other interviews that the man had conducted. Now, if I'm understanding things correctly, Roger's claim is that he is the sole surviving member of the family in Jan's story. He was in his family's camper when the attack began, which was sometime in the early evening. Hunter posits 5:45, and Roger did not contradict this in the comments, even though he did offer several corrections. And I want to be clear that part of the reason I was intrigued by Roger's account is that Roger was in the comments section offering changes and being like, this was really respectful and well done, but there were a couple of things I wanted to clarify, this, and this. So that tells me there is a Roger. This isn't made up. This isn't some third-person narrative. This is a story coming from a man who claims to have been there. But as Roger's account goes, the first thing he noticed was some shouting outside. Then his father Levi came running around the front of their camper, threw open the door, and grabbed a 20-gauge shotgun from behind the driver's seat. As Levi did this, Roger saw what he described as a 6.5-foot tall creature covered in black hair kill his brother Stephen. It may be important to note that on Wolfka's video, in the comments section, Roger made it clear that this was hair and not fur that covered the creature, and that what he saw did not have canine features, nor did it rip a bunch of bodies apart. Too little too late, because Stephen had unfortunately already been taken out, Levi managed to get a shot off, which hit the attacker in the upper body, neck, and face. If it's a 12-gauge shotgun, that's a kill shot, but with a 20-gauge, range matters. I will say I wanted to make a Dick Cheney joke, but that was a 28 gauge. Unfortunately for Levi, though, the creature did not go down easy, and it managed to subdue and kill Roger's father as well. Thankfully, at the time that all of this started, Roger had actually been loading up his own .410 shotgun and grabbing some soup cans to go outside and do some target practice. So, as the thing ran past the open motorhome door, he managed to get a shot off. But the thing about .410s is that they're not exactly any punchier than a 20 gauge, so even though he hit the creature in the upper back near the shoulder blade, it didn't go down. It did, however, make the unknown assailant run off. Roger used this opportunity to get out of the camper, crawl underneath it, and then position himself between the floorboards and the drive shaft, all the while believing that his sister and his mother were following him. In reality, the mother, Diane, and the sister, Connie, were still in the back of the camper, and by no means were they safe. The creature, or in Roger's belief, actually a second creature, attacked once more, killing Diane and pulling Connie out of the trailer. Unlike Jan's account, which was of course secondhand, Roger claims that Connie's body was left just behind the camper, rather than 50 yards into the forest and up in a tree. He also said that it wasn't some random young couple that called this in Grand Rivers. Instead, he says he ran off onto the main road, where he was eventually found by a farmer, if I remember correctly. Yes, a farmer. And that this man took him back to his farmhouse and then called the authorities. It does not say where the farmhouse was, or which authorities he called. So from this point, the story is actually considerably different. It's not the sheriff responding, but some unnamed federal or state agency. In Roger's version, the first responders here had military-style equipment, military-style vehicles. They actually found the creature dead in a tree, and there were no coroners present whatsoever. The entire thing was handled by one sole paramilitary agency, which actually makes the entire issue of there being no official records or even newspaper reports a lot more plausible. As for Roger, he didn't particularly say what he thought that the creature was, or at least not in the comments section of the video. I've reached out to try and get him to come on our live show so we can ask him some further questions, get some clarification, and hopefully come to an understanding about what his story really is. But until that happens, we can only really go on what we have. So what do we have? To be honest, I'm actually far more interested in Roger's version of events than Jan's, even though his came much later. There's a few reasons for that, but the really big one here is proximity. If this event actually did happen, then a survivor, someone who was there and experienced it, is a much more reliable source than someone who heard about it secondhand from people who she refuses to name. But beyond that, I found a few other problems with Thompson's narrative that suggest it may be invented. For example, she says that the attack was first reported in Grand Rivers, which means that the first responders, the authorities, should have been coming from Livingston County. Much was made in Jan's account of the story of the coroner's determination that the wounds, which by the way Roger seems to deny even existed, could not have been made by a tool, that they must have been the result of claws or teeth. The problem is that the coroner, Harry Van Smith, was almost certainly not a medical professional. According to a June 5, 1970 article in the Paducah Sun, Harry Van Smith graduated high school that year. Another article in that same paper, published May 25, 1977, reports that Harry won the seat of coroner that year as an incumbent. That means he was elected at least as early as 1975, and therefore could not have completed medical school. While I've been unable to verify the information via a second source, at least one marketing site lists Harry Van Smith as the owner of Smith Funeral Chapel, which would suggest that he was a mortician. This actually makes a good deal of sense for a coroner position in a small county like Livingston, but it doesn't make him equal to a medical examiner by any stretch. Beyond that, the story just feels a little too fantastical, a little too detailed for a third-person account retold decades later. When it comes to her 1978 story, I'm willing to believe that she did experience something strange, but I'd need to confirm a few things first. One of the things I would want to confirm is that the people she's talking about in her story actually exist, which includes her. I did find a Jan Thompson in the correct general area who would have been the right age, but not born in St. Louis, as she said in her interview. I also found a Rhonda who lived at the end of Thompson Avenue in Grand Rivers, but I can only confirm that as far back as 2002. Prior to that, her family used a P.O. box in town for their mailing address. Now, interestingly, there was no Joe or Joseph on those records, even though that character was listed as being Rhonda's brother, who lived in that house with her. And then there's the reaction to everything that happened. I just find it very difficult to believe that Jan's aunt and uncle would not call the authorities after their son returned home with claw marks, saying he'd been chased through the woods by a wolf man. And it's especially odd that they wouldn't tell anybody after the uncle in this story found pits of animal bones near the abandoned sawmill. And on top of all of that, Jan does seem like she's a little bit eccentric. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, it's just that something about the way Jan writes, the way that her reasoning seems to work, does make me wonder about her mental clarity. She was also extremely prolific on Guardian tales, with more personal experiences with the paranormal than any one person should reasonably have, and all of her writings are extremely detailed and stylized. What I mean by that is that she writes about things she was told of as if she was actually there. It could just be that she's attempting to really immerse the reader in the story and get them to place themselves there, but I don't know. I'm not saying that she's lying, I'm just saying that I don't have a strong reason to believe that her story is accurate. But then we have Roger, whose story is, aside from the strange description of the assailant, mostly believable. For one, this is federal land, so a federal response to what happened is perfectly reasonable. Some kind of paramilitary unit arriving on scene within only a few hours isn't what I would call normal, but then again, the problem Roger described was not a normal problem. If the farmer who picked him up had called the Forest Service instead of the Sheriff's Department, they might have decided to keep this internal, and it could very well have been immediate federal jurisdiction. Where it gets a little weird is figuring out which agency would have been responding, or if it would have been the National Guard. The Guard does have its own Green Berets, so Special Forces being called in is not out of the question, but it would probably have taken longer than a few hours to get all of the proper authorization through. Another possibility is the Forest Service, because they do have a law enforcement arm, but their uniforms look a lot more like park or forest rangers, or sheriff's deputies really, than they do soldiers. For that reason, I will be reaching out to the Park Service to ask a few clarifying questions. It should also be said that while I do not mean to in any way disparage Hunter or his work, I do disagree with his conclusions about what was behind this attack, if it did indeed happen. What I mean by that is that Hunter is of the opinion that this was some kind of werewolf, which I will note he does not seem to believe is a shape-shifting kind of monster. Though I could be wrong about what he considers to be a werewolf, I did not spend a ton of time trying to get to the bottom of that. Even with all of that, however, if the issue of who responded to this incident can be cleared up, I'm very intrigued by Roger's story as a whole. Roger said that this thing was only 6.5 feet tall and that it was covered in black hair, not fur. That's not an absurdly tall measurement, and there are disorders that cause people to be fully covered in hair. And on top of that, land between the lakes wasn't always a federally protected recreation area. In fact, it was pretty recent at the time that it had been changed over. Up until the Great Depression, this region was home to hundreds and hundreds of families, as well as a number of towns. As part of his New Deal, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt felt it would be beneficial to Americans if he flooded their homes in order to generate electricity for the aluminum industry. Better yet, he didn't even bother making the area a park. That was Kennedy. And then they shot him for it. Now, to be fair, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because the aluminum was needed for the war effort during World War II. But without getting too deep into the weeds of American financial history, this was not necessary to lift us out of the Depression. Suffice to say, there were ways to improve the economy that did not involve forcing people out of their homes for pennies on the dollar and then flooding the land so that they could never return. The reason I bring this up is that up until 1963, those living in the area that had not been flooded were permitted to remain there, and then the families were removed over the ensuing years. It's not out of the question, given the remote and isolated nature of the area, that people could still have been living out there in the forest, as some do still to this day in America's larger wildlands. I'm not talking about quote-unquote feral people here either. There are just normal human beings who live out their lives far from society, preferring nature to the civilized world. On the other hand, those people aren't usually covered in hair, but did this individual have to be? While it's not exactly next door, there are accounts from the Pacific Northwest, from the Skokomish and other native tribes, of taller, stronger clans which live in the mountains and wear hair-covered pelts to keep warm. So, could this have been a person wearing a pelt? It's not impossible. Alternatively, there are a few isolated incidents where people were reportedly actually raised by animals in the wild, and when found, they were for all intents and purposes feral. Arguably the most famous such case is that of Victor of Aveyron, who was recovered at the age of 9 in France, and since I got a French pronunciation right recently, I'm going out of my way to get it wrong. The subject of a unit in my high school psych class, Victor was a fascinating individual, if a tragic case in many ways. Even after he was brought back into society and people attempted to educate him, he never learned to speak, and while he could hear, he never really got language. What he lacked in communicative abilities, however, was balanced by a remarkable difference in a physical capacity. Victor was far less sensitive to the elements, possessing a much higher tolerance for cold than the average person. He could just run around in the nude in the snow, and it seemed like he wasn't bothered. But, of course, there are also those in more recent years who have questioned if Victor's life was properly understood at the time. He lived from around 1788 to 1828, when medicine overall was much less advanced, and psychology was still not really a thing. It would, of course, be several decades before Sigmund Freud burst onto the scene prescribing cocaine to treat ghosts in the blood. Is that a real thing he did? I don't know, but I saw it in a meme once. That said, Sigmund Freud wasn't alive yet. That was real. That part I was being serious about. Psychology, not a thing. King George at the time, he was insane, and they were like, this dude's weird. Guy had a number of things that psychologists today, just based off of descriptions, have been able to pretty confidently diagnose. And back then, they were just like, man, I guess he's just in a silly, goofy mood. Anyway, my point here is that when Victor was alive, there's a good chance that his doctors, his educators, might not have grasped what his actual problems were. To that end, some argued that Victor wasn't raised by animals, he didn't live his entire first 9 years out in the wild, but rather he had been abandoned later in childhood. In fact, some people question if he had ever actually lived in the wild at all, and if perhaps he had been abandoned right before he was found. Instead of attributing his condition to life in the wild, they believed he may have had some form of neurological issue or mental disability, and both his abandonment and his inability to speak or understand language were a result. But for our purposes, it doesn't really matter what caused Victor to be the way that Victor was. What matters is that people like Victor can and do exist, and that could have something to do with what Roger allegedly experienced in 1982. It could be that when most people left the land between the lakes, some stayed behind, not really understanding what was happening to their home. Years of isolation, neglect, and fear can do horrible things to the mind and the body. Is it so far-fetched, then, that a person who experienced that could be responsible? I don't think so, but then again, I'm still not entirely sure I believe that this story actually happened. I'm not closed off to it by any stretch. In fact, I'm considerably more open than I was when I first started writing this video. And that's because Jan's version is by far the most referenced one that I've seen, but it never felt particularly realistic. There were no eyewitness accounts, nothing of the sort, just one woman saying that somebody told her this story sitting outside of a gas station 45 years ago. Roger's account, on the other hand, scrubs away a good amount of the questionable aspects, and his YouTube channel proves that he's still out and about in the area. So I really hope that he accepts my invitation to come and talk. I know that he's seen it because he did the little thing where you heart a comment on your video, so I know he's seen the comment. But my point is, I really do hope that he'll come on the show and be willing to sit for an interview, because I would love to hear more about this story. And of course, I'd also love to know what you guys think about what you just heard. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the Land Between the Lakes story before, but have you heard Roger's version of it? Were you aware of any of the other stuff surrounding it? Tell me, do you think I missed something? Is there a big piece of evidence that we didn't consider? Because we will do an episode of our live show about this. And since I mentioned the live show, that is another place that you can get Lore Lodge content. Every Monday at 7 p.m., Aiden and I sit down, sometimes with a guest, to discuss the things we talk about on this channel. It's a much looser format where we take questions at the end, and it's a little more lighthearted and upbeat. So if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, we welcome you to come and join us for the live show on Monday nights. If you want other content from us, we are launching a new podcast with Stakuyi/History of Everything and Roman Helmet Guy that is going to be living on a channel called History Unhinged, which was formerly the History Hut channel. It does currently have several videos up already that are not from this exact podcast run, but if you go and watch those, it will help us get to monetization so that we can launch that show and really make it what we want it as soon as possible. I mean, the show's going to launch in January, monetized or not, just we'd love to make money off the bat, because we do have to, people have to fly and drive here, so it would be nice if they could cover that. And because we never know how to not be busy, we also have the Weird Bible podcast, which should be returning to a more consistent schedule in 2025. I know I said that last year, but maybe I'm right this time. It turns out that when you try and do shows with multiple content creators who don't live in the same apartment complex, it's hard to schedule. You can also find exclusive content from our channel over on our Patreon, where we do liquored lore, and where I have begun posting the entire term papers I write as scripts for these episodes. The Liquored Lore show that we do is just us having some drinks and talking about history, folklore, unsolved mysteries, whatever. And then these scripts that I post, I want you guys to know part of the reason I do it is for you. If you want to do your own content, I welcome you to use our research, so long as you give us some credit. My goal as a content creator has always been to give people information. That is the primary thing. I want people to know the most facts they can. And then after that, of course, it's, make a living. But if you guys want to go and do what I do, please do it, and do it with the factual stuff, because the more of us that are putting the factual stuff out there, well, the fewer people are making money off of the lies. If Patreon's not your thing and you want to support us in another way, we have merch from Bunker Branding. Aiden, bring your beautiful self here. Come to me, come to me, come to me, my child. My son. My fun. There we go. Can you see it? Can y'all see the shirt?
He is fully lifting it right now.
There we
I just
go.
want to acknowledge that.
Well, that's what the Lift Lodge shirt's for. Our merch is from Bunker Branding, and all of it is American made, American designed, and obviously American shipped. And it looks great, I must say. If you are a man who likes to accentuate your features, you can accentuate the sleeves. The sleeves are really where it's at. And we also have hoodies, so if you're trying to stay warm in the chilly months ahead, I recommend a Lore Lodge hoodie. If you're less into wearing the lodge and more into drinking the lodge, you can do so by going to tableauroastingco.com. I did not burp in the middle of that sentence. We're going to move right on past it. You can get our coffee Mount Pocono perk that I, a barista at an artisan roastery for many years, designed myself. I told Nat Moore I want this, and this, and the words Ethiopian and Honduran were in there, and it's chocolatey and nutty and fruity. It's actually, if you brew it right, it's almost like a tea. But basically the goal with the coffee when I was coming up with the flavor profile here was I want something that is sophisticated enough to drink black and really enjoy if you are a coffee person, but that's also mild and basic enough that putting cream and sugar in it isn't gonna give you something weird. I've had some like super light roast artisan coffees where if you added anything to it, it was just off. But this one, cream and sugar, great. Black, great. Espresso, great. You will not be disappointed. And you can also grab History of Everything. That's Stephen Bell and Gabby Bell. You can grab their coffee too, because we all collaborated on this, and there's even a bundle. I mean, there is a History and Mystery bundle that gets you Lewis and Dark and Mount Pocono perk, and also mugs. Last thing I would suggest is that if you want to get all of the updates, make sure that you're seeing stuff when it comes out, and learn about what other things we're up to, as well as interact with our community, you can go to bit.ly/jointhelodge to join our Discord. That is the platform where we are the most on the ball about every single announcement we make. And last but not least, if you liked the subject and style of this video as a little bit less of a, academic investigation and more of a storytelling investigation, please leave in the comments folktale, and if you prefer the academic style, leave professor. We're just gonna let everybody else figure out what that's about. With all of that said, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.